I started my career in the investment industry in 2013. So next year would actually mark 10 years of me surviving this industry. And not once over the last 9 years I ever thought I would actually invest in bonds. I mean, why would anyone want to buy bonds when interest rates have been just so low that when you adjust for inflation in real terms, you would actually be losing money by investing your money in bonds. But things have changed. I mean, a lot has changed over the last couple of months. And in September, for the first time, I actually bought some UK government bonds called gilts. And to be honest, it is actually the only sort of investments that I had which made me some solid positive returns this year. Anyway, there's nothing for me to take credit of actually, because if you are in the UK, you would probably know why that opportunity happened for us to buy some UK government bonds. In other words, someone messed up. But I've created this video to cover all kinds of bonds, not just UK government bonds, but US, Europe, non-government bonds, corporate, emerging market bonds, everything. So without further ado, let's get started on 3 top reasons behind why you might start to consider investing in bond for real. 1. Bonds are likely to give you a very attractive level of income once again after a very long time. As mentioned earlier, one of the reasons why everyone ditched holding bonds over the last many years was all to do with low level of yields. And the main reason behind why we had such low level of yields or interest rate in most countries is to do with ultra loose monetary policy. In other words, interest rate by monetary policy, which is the central bank of different country, have kept it very low. Some were even close to zero and some were even negative. And the reason behind why central banks actually decided to keep interest rate at all-time low was all to do with inflation. We've just had a very stable and low level of inflation before, minus the last 2 years. So if inflation is always under control, say around 2%, there was absolutely no reason for central banks to hike interest rate because there was no sort of pricing pressure for them to tame. And in specific places such as Europe, you actually had negative level of interest rates. To put it simply, a negative interest rate in government bonds, say in Europe, would have meant that the government is going to charge you money to give you the privilege to lend them the money that you owe. Just to think about it, it already sounds really crazy, but thank God we're out of that water. So negative interest rates have virtually disappeared. Poof. But the question is, why am I calling it an attractive income opportunity? Well, that's because generally bond returns are pretty boring because you can guess it. So before you invest in bond, you can actually guess or tell how much return you expect by investing in them. So the starting yield of a bond would tell you how much return you can expect from that bond if you hold it to maturity. So if you think about the US 10-year bond, which is currently yielding around 3.7%, if you hold that bond to maturity, then you can expect a return of 3.7% until that bond matures. So think about it, it's some sort of guaranteed 3.7% return should fare relatively well, right, compared to an uncertain equity market return where returns could be very low or even negative. And even when you think about inflation, I mean, at the moment we have a very high level of inflation both in the UK and in the US, but if you think long term, so if you think about the expected level of inflation over the next 5 years or 10 years, and you think that the monetary policies, so the central banks can bring inflation down close to target of say 2%, then that 3.7% would actually fare you a positive real return coming from government bonds. And believe me when I say that it's a huge change compared to the past when these real returns from government bonds were in a very deep negative territory. Number 2, compared to the high-risk equities, government bonds can actually be a pretty good alternative investment. Why do I say that? Well, look at this chart here. One of the ways to compare relative attractiveness between bonds and equities is to compare how much they are yielding. Since the global financial crisis, US government bonds hardly used to offer any decent amount of yields over what was already being offered by US equities. Here we're looking at S&P 500 dividend yield and US 10-year yield. But look now, the difference has reached a high not seen since the financial crisis. So by adding bonds in your investment portfolio, you can actually add a very decent amount of diversification without compromising on returns or income. And not only that, bonds actually can help to dampen the overall amount of investment risk in your portfolio. And that's because bonds are generally less risky compared to equities or stocks. Look at the two volatility charts here. One is of S&P 500, which is equities, and the other one is US corporate bond index. Higher the volatility, higher the level of swings you can expect in your investment portfolio. So a volatility of 10% means that on average, you can expect a plus or minus 10% movement from the average return of that investment, 68% of the times. I do have a more detailed video on investment risk. If you are at all interested, I will link it below. Feel free to check it out after this video. And number 3, fixed income investment or bonds have actually become a relatively cheaper option to invest in right now. And when I talk about cheap, I talk about valuation. So compared to history, it is now a relatively cheap time or an attractive opportunity to invest in bonds. So how do you measure whether a bond is cheap enough? Well, again, I'm going to go back to yields. Yield of a bond or a bond fund or an index will tell you whether that index or a fund or a bond have reached a desirable or an attractive entry point for you to start investing in. And another measure, which is again similar to yield, is called credit spreads. It is the added or the extra amount of yield that you can expect by investing in more riskier type of bond. So a normal yield on government bonds is essentially risk-free from default because you don't expect the UK or the US government to default. But if you invest your money in corporate, so if you lend your money to say Apple, you can do that as well. But that will come with some sort of corporate risk. So the company can actually default. So to compensate you for that, the company will offer you an extra bit of yield on top of your normal risk-free, government bond yield. So that extra bit is again called the credit spread. And that too helps you to identify whether that bond investment is relatively attractive. So let's look at this chart here. So again, I'm going to highlight that we are seeing level of yields not seen in over a decade. So the yields have gone up, and that means the prices have become low, so cheap. Why is that? Because remember that there is a negative or an inverse relationship between interest rate and prices of bond. But think long term and think in the future. These yields that has reached this level, of course it can go up a little bit more, but ultimately it has to fall back down again to a much more normal level. And when that happens, we should be seeing some really good positive return in our bond portfolio. So here you go. These are my top 3 reasons why you may want to start thinking about investing in bonds. So that's the relative cheapness, the attractive amount of income or return, and diversification benefit. And for openness, I do have investment in 2 separate bond funds. The first one is, as mentioned, is the UK gilts, UK government bonds, and the second one is global high yield. If you do have question on any of them or any part of this video, feel free to write a comment in the comment section below, of course. But that's all for today, and until next time, do look after yourself and your money.